Hello, this is Joel Beachy, and I am going to be doing my video presentation. This is for the 11th week, and I'm going to start by going through the readings and summarizing them, and then I will make comments as I go of each reading. The first one that I'm going to talk to you about is on the Theological Declaration of Barmen. So to summarize the text, this is regarding the Confessional Synod of the German Evangelical Church, which met in Barmen on May 29th to the 31st of 1934. And they were gathering in response or to respond to the national church that Hitler had recently imposed on the German people. The group consisted of Lutheran, Reformed, and United churches, free synods, church assemblies, and parish organizations. And they united in the Confessional Synod of the German Evangelical Church. The purpose of the group, as I was kind of mentioning, was to sort of speak with one voice, or try to come together to speak with one voice about specific evangelical truths. And I'm going to kind of talk about those, but those truths were in light of Hitler's imposing this national church agenda. So some of the things, these truths included that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through Jesus. And so this group of churches wanted to identify and acknowledge the authority of Jesus, and that there was no authority outside of this. So in part, the argument suggested that this national church then was illegitimate because it goes outside of acknowledging Jesus alone as the authority. They also mentioned speaking the truth in love, that we are to grow up in every way into Him who is the head into Christ. Again, the church rejects any mission that moves towards its own pleasure or changes in prevailing ideological and political convictions. So, again, that the agenda cannot be just strictly about the church beyond speaking to truth in love, acknowledging Jesus as authority. It can't just be an agenda that increases the church's power. Again, the German Evangelical Church rejected appointing special leaders or special people with ruling powers or authority, extra authority. Again, not identifying that the church doesn't have that role to do that, and that no one goes above Jesus. The church also rejected any taking on of a loftier role, or the state taking on the role of the church. So, for example, they didn't want to assume any of the function of the state, and they also didn't want the state to take on the functionality of church. They wanted those two to be separate. The church also publicly decried any misuse of the word and work of the Lord for the gain of the church itself. So again, if I think they saw this nationalist church as being detrimental to who they were wanting to be as a community of churches, that if this national church was too closely aligned to the government, that inevitably there'd be a corruption of that power. So, a couple comments just regarding this. I think the example of this evangelical group of churches points to the need for a strong separation of church and state, and this is something that's near and dear to Anabaptists and Mennonites. It's a highly valued position. I think by opposing Hitler's movement towards a national church, that the German Evangelical Church was realigning itself with the focus of vision of Jesus as the head of the church, and in separation of that church and state. That was the implication. That was what they were stating. The German Evangelical Church also demonstrated how important it is for ecumenical groups to be able to work together towards a common goal. Through these efforts, they found common ground to offer their social and political context. They could say who they wanted to be as representatives of Christ's church, and through a larger voice, by gathering together, they made their position more clear and louder, simply by having more collaboration. And they didn't, and by doing this, they did not allow themselves to simply be subject to the whims of the state. They were asserting themselves without being overly aggressive or using other methods other than stating who they were and who they wanted to be. I think this is important for us as well. Finding common ground in larger church context or a church body is something I hope for MCUSA and other denominations, especially within the U.S. Our ability to find ways to collaborate, to impact society, make a difference, I think demonstrates the unity of Christ and will be a stronger, more profound witness rather than devolving into sides that are simply bickering over a shrinking pie of the religiously affiliated. As we saw in Europe, or we see in Europe, we see the same trend here in the U.S. where fewer and fewer people are identifying themselves as believers, and instead of focusing all of our time fighting over that smaller group of people that do see themselves as believers, I think if we could work together towards a common goal, we would have a more profound impact than we do standing alone. Next, I want to move into this article, The Perception of Others' Fate, What Greek Orthodoxy Refugees from the Ottoman Empire Reported About the Destruction of Ottoman Armenians, the article by Herve Georgelin. And just to sort of summarize, the Greek Orthodox living in the Ottoman territories were privy, or that were alerted to, the genocide of their Ottoman Armenian counterparts. Although they had significant theological differences through oral memories, as we see in the article, there are instances where these two groups were aware of one another. They did brush up against each other. The Greek Orthodox tradition considered the Armenian Christians as monophysites, and the Armenian Apostolic Church disassociated itself from the Byzantine Church. The Greek Orthodox Christians took most notice of the plight of the Armenian Christians, in part because they feared that for their own safety. They feared that the same thing was going to happen to them. And they probably had legitimate reason to fear. In one instance, Armenians were massacred, and Orthodox Christians were arrested for fear of their association between the two groups. And another incident, 11 Orthodox Christians were mistakenly killed during a raid on Armenians. And so, yeah, as I mentioned before, the Greek Orthodox Christians probably had reason to fear. The author of the article stated, though the two groups were firmly established in their ideological differences, the systematic elimination of the Armenian group was a bad omen for the Greek Orthodox Ottomans. So just to comment on this, make a couple comments here. The difficulty, I would say, for the Greek Orthodox Christians is that they did not want to be linked in any way to the Armenians. They had fear of guilt by association, and this appeared to be a legitimate concern because there were Orthodox Christians that were killed or arrested because of their proximity. And guilt by association plays a role in how we deal with our differences between church groups today. I wonder if this is kind of a stretch here, but I wonder if this is not what's happening a little bit between MCUSA and various conferences that are pulling out of the denomination, or the startup group Ivana. Obviously the consequences are far less extreme. I mean, nobody's being killed, but the disassociation between groups under the umbrella of Mennonite Church USA has its own negative costs. One thing I would say is that the seeming lack of concern or indifference between the Greek Orthodox and the Armenian Christians is worrisome. I think my personal opinion is that it's a negative example to learn from in order not to repeat it in the future. Because despite theological differences, religious groups of any kind must stand together in the face of outright oppression and genocide. self-preservation does not provide enough justification for inaction. And so I feel like, obviously I wasn't there, I don't understand maybe the full context, but it seemed like the Greek Orthodox Christians needed to respond maybe in a larger way than they did. In the next article, or the next section, I'm going to spend a little bit longer in summarizing the McCulloch chapter. It's fairly lengthy, and this is the one, Not Peace But a Sword. So the year dates 1914 to 1960 from our Christianity, the First 3,000 Years book. So in this chapter this week, McCulloch offers a view of the shifting landscape away from a strong centralized Christian church in many regions in and around Europe, leading up to, during, and following the World Wars. The impact of the movements caused a significant shift in power away from church, both Catholic and Protestant, in areas where that was a long-standing tradition, where the Catholic Church had remained in power for a very long time, and where Protestant churches were gaining power, had asserted themselves over a long period of time. So just to highlight several of these, in Russia, for example, the church was confronted by the Bolsheviks, and led by the incident where Joseph Stalin assassinated Patriarch Tikhon in 1925. And the Bolsheviks didn't just rebel against the church because of its authority, but also because of its hatred of religious practice. And so this extended far beyond the official church. They rebelled against church in many other instances. Some of those affected by this were actually Mennonites in Russia during this revolution, and sometimes they were hardworking farmers. These farmers were looked at as part of the bourgeoisie. They were easy targets because they were hardworking, so they had amassed some significant wealth, which the revolutionaries were jealous of or angered by, and so they would attack them. They also became easy targets because of their peace stance, so they were not going to retaliate in most instances. Few instances people retaliated, but by and large the Mennonites wouldn't retaliate, and so they became easy targets to steal from, to pillage their communities, including raping and murdering. In Austria-Hungary, this region underwent similar changes, distancing from the church, in part because the Holy Roman Empire heirs quit after the region's the region's collapse. In Germany, we saw the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm, which also created this distance between the church and the state. In the Ottoman Empire, we saw the genocide of the Armenian Christians, which I mentioned in the earlier article. Assyrian Christians fought to maintain their stake in the area, but they were made to be a part of the British sort of puppet kingdom in Iraq. So they were moved there, and it did not bode well for them. They were not warmly received and struggled there. In the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, it led to a huge population exchange, and this is one of the pieces of history that I found fascinating, where religious Christians became Greek by default, despite language and culture, and in reverse, Muslims became Turks, regardless if they had lived in that region or before or not. So they were moved there, and this is a huge population swing. The only exception to this was in Istanbul, but even there, which was formerly Constantinople, but even there, in the mid-50s, there were pogroms in Istanbul, and the Christian population was decimated. And following those, there were fewer than 2,000 Christians remaining in that area. France helped to buoy the Lebanese Christians